Hey guys, it's Mrs. Itrola. I wanted to take some time to go over your AP Government FRQs with you, to go over some of the finer points just to get you guys prepped and ready so you know exactly what you're going to be looking at and the best way to go about answering them to maximize your scores and you guys take your test in May. Like Mr. I said, this is obviously a very, very different exam administration than it has been in years past. So you're going to have two different questions. FRQs only for a grand total of 45 minutes. So we're really going to want to work on just kind of getting you guys focused and ready to go so that you can maximize the amount of time that you spend on your answers and get the most points possible. So what we're going to go over today is not going to be both of the questions, but actually the second question you'll be answering on your test on May 11th, which is going to take you'll have about 15 minutes. Not about 15 minutes, you'll have 15 minutes to answer this question when it comes to you, and it's going to make up 40% of your exam score. So let's get into it and see what you guys can expect. All right, so this is actually going to be the second question that you answer on your AP exam, but we're going over it first just because it's a little bit shorter and a little bit more condensed, and it's kind of a really great place to start. So what it is going to be a concept application. And so what that means is that they're going to provide you with a political scenario. And then your job will be to respond to that scenario and then describe and explain the effects of a political institution, behavior, or process. So it's going to be a three-part question. It's going to be the second question on the exam, and it's going to make up for 40% of your overall score, and you'll have 15 minutes to respond. So you were asked in the introductory video this week to make sure that you had a sheet of paper so you could write down some answers to the guided notes as we go through this. So your guided notes question number 1, explain what a concept application question will ask you to do. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump in to this with an example because it's kind of a funky way to say, like, you're going to be given a scenario and ask how an institution will respond. So let me show you exactly what they're going to be asking you. This is actually the question that was given on last year's exam. So here we go. So here's your example. Since 2008, the Alliance Defending Freedom, a conservative Christian interest group, has promoted an annual event known as Pulpit Freedom Sunday. On this occasion, pastors are encouraged to challenge a provision of the tax law known as the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits political activity by certain nonprofit organizations, including religious organizations. While the Johnson Amendment does not restrict religious leaders from speaking out regarding social issues, it does prohibit them from contributing money to political campaigns or speaking out in favor of or against candidates running for political office. On Pulpit Freedom Sunday, as an act of civil disobedience, pastors and religious leaders preach openly about the moral qualifications of candidates seeking office. So this is actually not a question. This would be the scenario that you're provided before the questions even show up. So for guided notes number 2, in one sentence, describe the issue outlined in this scenario. So following that scenario, you're going to be given a 3-part question. Okay, so for this particular scenario, Part A will describe an action Congress could take to address the concerns of the interest group in this scenario. So your focus on this one for Part A would be what specifically would Congress do to address the concerns of the Alliance Defending Freedom, and that's the conservative Christian interest group that was mentioned in that scenario. For Part B, in the context of the scenario, explain how partisan divisions could prevent the action described in Part A. Now, this is very, very important. I want you guys to make sure that you understand that first phrase in this question is in the context of the scenario. So make sure that you do your best to focus your answer onto exactly this specific scenario. Don't get stuck starting to talk about different powers that Congress has or things that they can do if it does not specifically apply to, to this scenario in particular, as well as what you said Congress should do in Part A. So you're building on your response to Part A. Then when you get to Part C, here you would explain why the Alliance Defending Freedom might argue that their constitutional rights are threatened by the Johnson Amendment. So this is going to be a really great part for you to show off not only your knowledge of how to, of what Congress can do, but also your knowledge of how, of the Constitution and constitutional rights, as well as different things like the Johnson Amendment. So keep those things in mind as we move forward. So for guiding notes number 3, what 3 things must you do to completely answer the question in your own words? All right, so on the AP exam, you can earn 3 possible points for this question. So the way that it'll work in class for your grade here is if you answer these FRQ questions and you get all 3 points, you'll receive 100%. If you get 2 out of 3 points, you'll receive a 75%. 1 out of 3 points would be a 50%. And if you just totally didn't answer the question or decided to share your favorite recipe for whatever cookies you're making during the quarantine, you'll get 0 and you'll be sad. So don't do that. So the way that you can earn those points back again is you'll receive very specific feedback regarding your answer, and you can just basically kind of add an amendment, add a little bit or an addendum, whatever you want to call it, and answer or clarify some of the stuff that is mentioned in the feedback that you receive. So for Part A, to earn your full point for Part A for this particular scenario, 1 point would be earned for describing an action Congress could take to address the concerns of the interest group in the scenario. So, and this is not an exhaustive list, but here's a couple examples of what could be used for this particular answer. And one thing Congress could do would be to pass a law that would reverse the Johnson Amendment completely. Or Congress could pass a law to allow religious organizations to participate more directly in politics. So for your guided notes question number 4, in your own words, what must you do to earn 1 point for Part A? Okay, so for Part B, you could also earn 1 point. Now, this one is a little bit tricky as far as what maybe you remember from class, because I know that you didn't really get into the actual politics part of it. So don't worry if you don't necessarily understand what we're talking about with partisan divisions, but just know that there's a couple of different possibilities. And of course, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a couple of, possibilities. So 1 point is earned for explaining in the contents of the scenario how partisan division could prevent the action described in Part A. So in this instance, partisan divisions make it more difficult to pass a law because parties adhere to different ideological points of view. Or if Congress and the president are from different political parties, the president might threaten to veto the legislation. So again, those are 2 possibilities for Part B. And what I think is really great, especially as an English teacher who doesn't really like black and white, right or wrong answers, like you find like in math or different things like that, you can really use your knowledge of what you've learned in the class to explain it. So here for guided notes number 5, in your own words, what must you do to earn 1 point for Part B? Okay, and then Part C, it's the same thing, 1 point, but here 1 point is earned for explaining why the Alliance Defending Freedom might argue that their constitutional rights are threatened by the Johnson Amendment. And this Part C, guys, is really where you can show, like, allow your knowledge to shine, because, you can explain what you know about constitutional rights and about different amendments or documents or cases or whatever they may give you. So the Alliance Defending Freedom and other religious groups might argue that their First Amendment rights are being violated, or the Alliance Defending Freedom and other religious groups might argue that their freedom of speech or religion is being violated. So in guided notes number 6, in your own words, what must you do to earn 1 point for Part C? All right, so my tips and tricks section is really not that long. My advice to you would be to answer in a concise fashion, but also be sure that you briefly explain your reasoning. So what I mean by that is it's really important for you to demonstrate your knowledge of the concepts that you learned in class. So it's really your shot to show what you know, so you can provide a brief definition or a summary or an explanation of your point. For example, when we go over the student example, you'll see that constitutional rights are addressed very specifically, and also, knowledge of the Johnson Amendment will be explained specifically. So use this chance to go ahead and just expand a little bit to show that you did learn some valuable information in your AP Government class. So let's take a look at the following student sample, which earned full points. All right, so for this one, I went ahead and I took the entire student response directly from the AP website. So this is a scanned copy of exactly what this student turned in. So you can see the amount of information that they put there. Now it is, like I said, concise, but this isn't like an exhausting essay that answers the entire question. This is something that gives us a good amount of information and can easily be answered within 15 minutes and definitely shows, what the student knows. So let's take a look at this briefly. I want you to go ahead and read through it because I'm going to read through the different pieces with you and kind of explain how they earned each point in the following slides. But for guided notes number 7, you'll definitely need to read the student response and answer the question, what action does the student suggest Congress take to address the issue in this scenario? Okay, so I told you already, spoiler alert, I guess, this student earned full points. So this would be 100% for what gets turned in class. So their response to part A was Congress, and the question was, describe an action Congress could take to address the concerns of the interest group in the scenario. So their response was, Congress can pass a provision of the Johnson Amendment. The provision can allow religious leaders to speak for or against certain candidates. Therefore, the Johnson Amendment can only restrict contributions of money. So this response earned 1 point in Part A by explaining that Congress could pass provisions that allow religious leaders to speak for or against certain candidates. The student also briefly addresses the premise of the Johnson Amendment, fully demonstrating their knowledge of the course content. Now, notice they didn't go into a lot of detail about everything with the Johnson Amendment, but it does talk about a restriction that is included in there, and that's restricting contributions of money from religious organizations. So again, they put in a little extra detail that just kind of shows like what the change would be and, what restrictions would remain. So for guided notes number 8, according to this student, how could the Johnson Amendment be changed to allow religious leaders to speak for or against certain candidates? All right, so part B is where we get a little bit more detail going on. So part B for this, the question again was, in the context of the scenario, explain how partisan divisions could prevent the action described in part A. So again, with this one, the main important thing you have to remember when you're writing is that you don't want to go off on a tangent about different things Congress could do. Don't talk about how Congress could write provisions on amendments and things of that nature. Focus on this scenario specifically and your suggestion to what needs to be fixed. So in this instance, the student said, this new provision can lead to partisan divisions because it is a more conservative or Republican plan. Congress today is more divided between the two parties. Democratic lawmakers will not agree with this new provision because it gives religious groups too much power and somewhat weakens the division between church and state. So again here, this response earned 1 point in Part B by explaining that the action outlined in Part A could be prevented by stating Congress is more divided between the two parties and explains that Democratic lawmakers will not agree. So it shows, that this student understands how partisan politics works. It also shows that they understand a little bit of the conservative or Republican side versus what Democratic lawmakers or Democratic congressmen might see. Okay. So for guided notes number 9, according to this student, what could prevent the action suggested in Part A? And finally, part C. And again, this one I really like because it allows you to kind of show off a little bit more of your knowledge. So part C, the question here was explain why the Alliance Defending Freedom might argue that their constitutional rights are threatened by the Johnson Amendment. So here's the student's response for part C. The Alliance Defending Freedom can argue that their First Amendment rights are threatened by the Johnson Amendment. This is because religious leaders or organizations cannot publicly support a candidate, therefore, it limits their free speech. Also, the government cannot limit their free speech unless there is a clear and present danger, which in this case, there is not. So again, this response earned 1 point in Part C by stating the interest group can argue that their First Amendment rights are threatened. The student then explains the way in which the group's rights are threatened and also addresses a situation which would allow the government to limit free speech. So it didn't just say their rights are threatened. It actually specifically talked about what in that amendment they feel is limiting their free speech, their First Amendment rights. And so then what this student did, which furthers their showing off, I guess you could say, of their knowledge that they learned in class, is that they did go ahead and acknowledge that the government cannot limit your free speech, your rights to free speech, unless there's a clear and present danger. And then the student, continues on to say, in this particular instance, there's no threat to clear and present danger, or there is no clear and present danger as a result of these actions. So it just kind of throws out a little bit more pizzazz to show, yeah, you could say that they are arguing that their First Amendment rights are threatened by the Johnson Amendment, but you're not going to get a full point by that or for that because you're not explaining what exactly that means. So show off your knowledge of the Constitution and the amendments, and maybe in this case, a little exception to that where that might occur. So guided notes number 10, what would allow the government to limit citizens' freedom of speech? All right, so now it's your turn. So here is the new scenario and questions A, B, and C for you to practice this FRQ and turn in for the assignment that is due this Wednesday at 9 o'clock. So you have a couple of options. You can either go ahead and just create a Google Doc directly on Google Classroom. And the way that you do that, if you're not familiar with it, is when you click on the assignment, you'll be able to see, like in that upper right where you add your assignment, you can click add or create, and you can simply click create Google Doc, and you can just type it directly in there and just submit it. It's really easy. Google saves everything. It's awesome. Or if you are not feeling the technology, you do have the option of handwriting it, snapping a picture, and uploading it. And of course, if you have any questions, if you're having any kind of technical difficulty, go ahead and shoot Mr. I a question over Remind, and he'll get back to you, as quickly as possible, to make sure that you can get everything in on time and everything that you would like. So briefly, I'm going to go through this question with you. And hopefully clear up anything that might be a little bit confusing as you move forward. So here's the scenario. Consumers complained after EpiPen maker Mylan hiked the price of the emergency auto injector by $100 in recent months for no obvious reason. The price has increased 450% since 2004, when a dose cost $100 in today's dollars, to its current price of more than $600. The medication itself isn't expensive. Analysts calculate that the dosage contained in a single pen is worth about $1. So after reading the scenario, respond to A, B, and C below. So for A, describe a power Congress could use to address the comments outlined in the scenario. So for you guys, think about what Congress does. Feel free to refer for your notes for help. Part B, in the context of the scenario, explain how the use of congressional power described in Part A can be affected by its interaction with the presidency. So think about the president's power over Congress, what they can and cannot do. For Part C, in the context of the scenario, explain the steps Congress could take if the president doesn't agree with their plan. So for this one, think about the system of checks and balances. Again, if you have any questions moving forward, please go ahead and reach out on Remind. Or if you have questions about this assignment or others, you can always add a private comment when you upload your assignment. Or if you feel like it's something that you're comfortable sharing your questions and the whole class might benefit, you can go ahead and pop that question in the home page of your Google Classroom where it says class discussion. And Mr. I will make sure that those things are responded to either, independently if it's something very specific to your work, or, on another video or some kind of a class announcement in the future. So I hope that this helps a little bit with your comfort and confidence working with this particular kind of FRQ. And don't worry, I know that you're very worried about not having enough practice, so we'll supply you with many different questions where you can practice this. I know you're really, really excited about that. Anyway, like I said, I hope it helped, and I'll be back to talk over another PowerPoint when we go over your other FRQ soon. Thanks so much.